Welcome, creative friends. Edna Eady here from The Creativity Activist. Welcome to Stamping 102. This is a little series where I'm giving you some insight into the tools and supplies that I use in my creative space. And for this part of the series, this is about stamping. And today I'm going to focus on inks and the different inks that I have in my arsenal that make stamping successful for me. So I'm going to talk through them, the properties that I know of with them. I'm no expert by any means, but this is what works for me. And I've collected a lot over the years. Some I've let go, but most I've hung on to. And in the context of stamping, there are generally two types of ink, a dye ink and a pigment ink. And with some of the dye inks, you definitely get properties that make them permanent inks. And StazOn is one of the old and tried and tested permanent inks. It's probably one of the first solvent ink pads I've ever owned way back in the day. I'm just looking for something other than the stamp. I'm going, oh, here we go, we'll use this one. So I'll just give you a look at StazOn. So this is a felt pad. So you can see the felt in the pad, which means it's a relatively flat surface. It's got a linen top to it, this particular ink pad, which means it holds the ink in and it disperses it in an even way. And in the StazOn ink pads, they come with a little top in them. The trick of the trade is to secure that top inside the lid with a glue dot, and that will mean that your stamp set should remain pretty much inky. I don't think I've used this stamp pad for years because I don't tend to use a solvent ink anymore, so I'm not even sure if it's going to have much ink in it, but we'll see how we go. It definitely smells very different to any other ink pad when you have a solvent in there, and it is the solvent that makes it permanent. So you can see there that is a relatively dry ink pad if it's only doing that, but it will be permanent. So we will test that out in a moment. I'm just using a wet wipe today, but I would normally use something that doesn't kill the environment so much. But that's what I had at hand today. And then the other permanent ink that I use, and I have a lot of, is archival ink. So this does traditionally obviously come in black, but it also comes in lots of colours. So it also is a felt ink pad. You can see the felt there, and it has a linen top as well. And it's just a case of inking that up. I'm going to use this Hello stamp on most of them today. The reason I didn't use that with the solvent is it would leave a residue, and I didn't want that to interrupt any of the other examples that I do. So this is Hello in an archival ink. So you'll note that Viola's with me today, my foam pad, just to help the stamping process. So you can see that is quite a good coverage of the Hello from an archival. So you can see on the front here, acid-free, permanent and waterproof. So you can stamp this not just on paper, but you will note you'll get some residue off there, but they are the inks that will stain your stamps. Doesn't mean you can't use your stamp. I certainly give it a good clean as much as I can, and then I just keep going. So that's archival ink. And we might just, as we're going along, write archival so that when we come back and test them. So archival I have in black, brown and grey. So these are the permanents that I use all day, every day in a stamping sense. And you'll note I have multiple blacks because I have multiple workstations, so I tend to keep them. And then they also come in all sorts of amazing colours. So you can see this is a pink, it's on the felt and linen topped pad. I've re-inked this a number of times. Not sure if I've re-inked it recently. This will be a test. Doesn't feel very juicy to me, but we will see. and certainly some of the black residue that was on there stayed there. So don't worry about those things too much. You get a bit of ink in your ink pad, you can just wipe off that residue. It's not going to affect it too much moving forward, but unless you get a proper ink cleaner solution, you'll have this residue on your stamps until, you know, it goes away. So I'm just going to stamp that off so that I can keep using this particular ink pad as we go along. And it's good for you to see what does stain and doesn't stain ink. And there's definitely a spray bottle solution to get that off. I find with a lot of letter stamp sets that I only ever really stamp in black. I don't even clean them. I just keep going with the process, and eventually we get to a point where they're just black. I only use black with them. So this also is archival. So if you were stamping that archival, if you were stamping a different stamp, let's do it in the orange just so that you can see that. A different stamp, the one that doesn't have, well, might have staining, but if it generally doesn't have staining, then it just stamps like every other stamp session that we've done. It's really just that black was pretty fresh, that's why I did that. And then the other black that I have kept in the past is Memento in Tuxedo Black and other colours like that rich cocoa that's sitting there. This is specifically an ink that's great with alcohol markers. So if you use any form of alcohol markers like a Copic marker, then you will need an ink that the alcohol doesn't make bleed. And Memento Tuxedo Black was kind of the OG for that type of application, and it comes in other colours, but most people always have that black Memento, and we'll use an alcohol marker on these later and we'll see whether or not it affects it or not. And the one thing I find with Memento is if I'm wanting a dark application, then I will use a stamping platform and make sure I stamp it a couple of times. And then the hybrid between permanent, so you can use it with water, and alcohol ink resistant is this amalgam ink from Gina K. So just ink that up like you do any other stamp pad, and we'll just stamp it. It doesn't really look any different. I do say that it is blacker than the Memento ink, and you know, they all come with re-inkers, and that one is quite dry, so let's just do a little session on re-inking. So it's a foam and felt and linen top, jet black inker. Just run it along your ink pad until it comes out, so you can see that maybe in the light, but it's letting out the ink, and I'm just running it along the top. It will disperse itself. You could technically just squeeze this all in one spot. I tend to go along in different zigzags just to help the disbursement process. So you can go and re-ink. Normally once you've re-inked, I would recommend just leaving it for an hour or so, just so that it gets to a point where it's gotten into all the nooks and crannies. We'll just give it a go straight away, see if it's enough ink, and that's the way to tell whether or not you need to apply more ink. You can see there that's much darker. So I would generally go back a few times with that inking process when it's that dry, just to totally re-ink that ink pad. Now the black that I recommend for everyday stamping of sentiments, when you're not wanting to use that particular ink pad for alcohol markers or for watercolouring, this is my go-to ink, VersaFine Clair by Tsukaneko, Japanese brand. I do tend to tap onto my stamp. There's no rule. You can tap the stamp onto the pad, or you can tap the pad onto the stamp. So this is the Everyday Black ink that I use, and you can see there it is a lot darker. It's a fine dye ink in a very fine felt, topped felt pad, and I love it. And if you don't have that in your kit, for specifically for doing outlines or sentiments, I think you're probably doing yourself a bit of a disservice. So once you get out of those, they're kind of all the colours that I would use for using with outline stamps. And then when we move on to coloured stamps, so these are all being dye-based inks to date. And once we start getting into oxides, they're blends. And then we have these everyday dye-based inks. This is the one that I used in the previous stamping video, Sorbet by Concord and Ninth. So it's a dye-based ink. Once again, it has a felt pad. And it's the same old story. You can tell this is a very juicy ink pad just by the fact that it sticks to the pad pretty well. But let's just give it a double tap and get as much ink on there as we can. I can tell automatically that there's a lot of ink on there, but that's okay. Let's go in and do a normal dye-based ink. And then these come in 7,000 million colours, and of course all of the stamp companies have started to bring out their own inks. The other ink that you get into when you want to have a bit of colour in your life is you might choose to move on to metallic inks. I like these inks by Sukaneko. I think it's pronounced Delicata, but once you start getting into pigment inks, which are any inks that carry colour with a pigment base, you'll see that the pad is normally a foam pad. And one of the reasons for this is the particles in the ink are much bigger and they won't disperse in the felt pad, so they need a foam pad. There's lots of rules and information around the difference between the types of ink pads, and you can go off and read those, but the most important thing to remember is you just got to play around until you find the ink pads that you like. I tend to like a felt-based ink pad and a dye ink. I really do. Back in the old days, we used to always have pigment inks, particularly if we were doing embossing. I don't think they're as important to have anymore. There are other options. So you get down there into a situation where you've got a metallic ink. So if you're going metallic, you're always going to get a lot of residue. I have this little piece of paper off to the side all the time, and I take off as much of the residue on that paper as I can before I would go in and use any cleaning solution. But you can see here it just comes off with water. It doesn't have any solvent in it. It's water-based. It's just holding that pigment in the binder that's in the ink pad. There we go. So let's go on to distress inks. So these inks are well loved in my creative space, but you'll notice the difference between the original distress ink, which has a black surround, and the distress oxide, which has this grey or silver surround. So this is a dye-based ink, and this is a blended dye and pigment ink, and has an oxidization effect in it. They were brought to the market for use with water, so they disperse when they have water connecting to them. These do not stamp very well at all. That's not their purpose, but let's go in and stamp with it so that we can see. So it will stamp, and it will generally hold, but a lot of the time, particularly if you use this with an acrylic rather than a photopolymer stamp, it will bead on the top of the acrylic. So if you've used acrylic stamps with those and it hasn't worked, that's why. And then you move on to these Distress Oxides, and in a straight stamping application, they work just like a dye-based ink pad. They look and feel the same. They're just carrying a different type of ink in them. They do stamp really well, particularly if you're doing outlines, but you do notice that there's imperfections in it. And that's because it's not traditionally a stamping ink as such to get perfection like you would get over here with this VersaFine, because the pigments in them are quite large, like the particles. But they do stamp, and they stamp up beautifully. And the thing to really note with an oxide, which is a really nice thing to understand, is they will also, like the metallics, they stamp really nicely on dark cardboards or papers. So this is a black paper with that same ink. And once it dries in particular, you will see that working on that dark background. And the thing to remember with these inks, the Distress Oxides, is when you use them for stamping, particularly, you need to allow drying time because they are a pigment blend. And one of the things with a pigment over a dye is that they take a lot longer to dry. So this will actually dry and then it will brighten as it dries. So that's important to understand when you get to Distress Oxides. And then the last ink I thought I'd share with you today is a Versamark ink. Now this is my original packaging of Versamark. I don't know if the packaging's changed, but the reason I mention this is I can't even remember how many years ago I got this. It was when I was in my 20s, which was a very long time ago. Decades and decades and decades ago. And it still goes. It still looks pretty good. I cleaned it out once and I re-inked it. I've re-inked it hundreds of times. And most people use Versamark these days when they want to apply an embossing powder and then heat set it so that it's got texture. Its original application was to apply a watermark to the card. So you take a coloured piece of card and you press the ink onto the card and you take it away and it leaves a watermark. And this is one that dried a little while ago. So you can imagine using florals. You can have some watermark florals and some coloured in florals in front and behind one another, and it works really nicely. Or when it's still wet, you can put embossing powder over it and it will emboss. So they're the types of inks that I have in my arsenal. So let's just do a test on them. So this was Distress, and this was Distress Oxide, and this was re-inked amalgam. So this is a Copic marker on the permanent. Archival. So permanent, but the alcohol marker doesn't like it. This is the Memento, built for those markers, so you can see that it doesn't bleed at all. This is the amalgam, also meant for those markers, doesn't bleed at all. This is the VersaFine. Not bleeding now that it's pretty dry, but I wouldn't use that. This was the metallic down here, amalgam. distress. And I think what you'll find also, which is probably just important to test, is the distress does dry into your paper. So if we just put some wet distress down, you're going to need to do that to do the water test. So you see here that that will bleed with water. This will bleed with water, but these ones, these permanent ones, should not bleed with water. Memento does not bleed with water. Amalgam doesn't. Once you get over here, when that's fresh, in particular, this VersaFine, it will bleed with water, and your stamp image will bleed out from that. So that's important to understand. So there you go. They are the different inks that I have in my arsenal and how I use them. This is budget white card. So really the trick of the trade is to find the right card that you can use across all of your ink applications, and just to understand that those applications are there for a purpose and you buy inks for a particular purpose. And when you want to use them in any other way except direct stamping, there's a whole other suite of techniques. So it's important to understand that. And don't forget the notion that if you're doing an outline, then a stamping platform and a repeat application of any of these inks will be your friend in the stamping world. This was Stamping 102. I hope you've taken something away from it and that you're being creative today. Enjoy.